Hey horror fans, it's Jay, and we're back here again at Jay vs. Horror for another look at a great year in horror film history. Now recently I did a video about the year 1981 where I claimed that I thought it was the greatest year in horror history, and I challenged some of the fans out there to come up with some of their ideas about what might be the greatest year in horror history. So we're going to be going through those years just like we did the one I picked, just to be fair, so everyone can have their opinion heard. And so one of the ones that we got suggested the most, probably 10 or 15 times, we had 1984 suggested. So we're going to run down the films of 1984 pretty quickly, and then I'll go back and talk about some of the ones I like the best, and you guys can let us know how you feel. Do you think 1984 is the greatest year of all time for horror films, or do you think it's 1981? Or maybe you have a whole nother year. I've heard we have a lot of suggestions for 1980. Someone even suggested 1996, which I went and looked, and it's actually not that bad of a year. I wouldn't call it the greatest, but it's not that bad of a year. So let's get started, guys, with 1984 horror films. The Barbaric Beast of Boggy Creek Part 2. Bloodsuckers from Outer Space. Chud. Children of the Corn. The Company of Wolves. Day of the Reaper. Deadly Intruder. Disconnected. Don't Open Till Christmas. Fatal Games. Firestarter. Friday the 13th, the final chapter. Ghostbusters. Gremlins. The Hills Have Eyes Part 2. Hunters of the Night. The Initiation. Innocent Prey. Invitation to Hell. Monster Dog. Night of the Comet. A Nightmare on Elm Street. Razorback. Rocktober Blood. Satan's Blade. Scream for Help. The Sea Serpent. Shadows Run Black, Silent Madness, Silent Night, Deadly Night, Splatter University, Strangler vs. Strangler, The Tenant, Terror in the Isles, and of course, The Toxic Avenger. So there's 30 movies there, guys, and just in volume alone, 1984 doesn't really stand up to 1981, which had about 70 films, and 1980, which also had about 70 films. But there are some really big hitters on this list, right? So let's just look at some of our favorites. I call them my favorites, but they're pretty much everyone's favorites. We have Chud, of course, with John Hurd, Kim Greist, and Daniel Stern. So we have two of the stars from Home Alone in this weird movie about cannibal, humanistic underground dwellers. That's what Chud stands for, guys. And although Chud is not a great film, it is a cult film, and it's one I like to go back and rewatch every now and then. Of course, we have Children of the Corn with Peter Horton and Linda Hamilton. And Linda Hamilton was a pretty big star around this time. This is the Terminator era for Linda Hamilton. Children of the Corn is not my favorite Stephen King adaptation. I do like the movie, and it is fun to watch. But I just felt like there was something missing from the movie that was in the book that made it a little more creepy. Also, some of the relationships between the people in the book are very different. But yeah, Children of the Corn. Moving on, we have Neil Jordan's The Company of Wolves with Angela Lansbury and David Warner and Stephen Ray. Good movie. Don't Open Till Christmas, which was a fun slasher type film, I believe. I could be wrong. Firestarter. Now this is between those two. Between Firestarter and Children of the Corn, I have to go with Firestarter. David Keith is in this, and Drew Barrymore and Heather Locklear has a small role in it. Just a great film, and I love, this is where, this almost feels like a Cronenberg film, right? Because it's horror, but it's not paranormal horror. It has to do with science and stuff like that, and this one feels like it should have been directed by David Cronenberg, but was actually directed by Mark Lester. Cronenberg directed Dead Zone the year before. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Firestarter. I know it's not necessarily a scary film. Also George C. Scott in Firestarter, so you can't go wrong there. Friday the 13th, the final chapter, directed by Joseph Zito. Also credit here for Joe Hoffman on direction. But this is everybody's one of their favorite Friday the 13th sequels. It's also one of the first lies in the franchise because it's absolutely not the final chapter. Stars Crispin Glover, Kimberly Beck, and Barbara Howard. And yeah, it's just one of the better Friday sequels, really, and they put some effort into this one. They tried to tie things up a little bit, but there was no killing off Jason. Next, we have Ghostbusters, of course, directed by Ivan Reitman, Bill Murray, Harold Ramis, Dan Aykroyd, and Ernie Hudson. What can I say about Ghostbusters, guys? It's a horror comedy. I strain to put Ghostbusters in any horror category, even horror comedy, because it just never scared me. I mean, even as a kid, I knew it was funny, and I loved it for the special effects and the comedy. But I never considered it to be a horror film, and I think part of that is Slimer. Slimer connected with kids. They used Slimer for several things later on to sell stuff to kids. There were Slimer lunchboxes, thermoses. Of course, the real Ghostbusters cartoon featured Slimer. And there was Slimer toothpaste. There was Slimer everything. And so I never considered it a comedy. But, I mean, a horror movie per se. I always just thought it was a comedy. And it almost seems more sci-fi to me than horror. Except for the fact it's called Ghostbusters and there are several ghosts in this movie. I have heard other people say that they were affected differently by it as a kid, but for me it was just fun. Gremlins with Zach Galligan and Corey Feldman, directed by Joe Dante, another great 80s film. I mean, some of these are just really big hitters, guys. We just had 3 in a row. Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter, Ghostbusters, and Gremlins, all big hitters. The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 now. 84 is a big year for Wes Craven, right? And he has 2 kind of bombs here. One is The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, starring Michael Berryman. But nobody really loved Hills Have Eyes Part 2. It's not the worst movie I've ever seen, but it seems to be on the downswing for Wes. This is before or around, A Nightmare on Elm Street. So Wes is hit and miss in this era. And until after Nightmare on Elm Street, when he went on to have some more success in the later 80s. So the other one here from Wes Craven is actually called Invitation to Hell. And I've seen this one a few times. It's a fun movie. It was actually a TV movie that was done as part of Susan Lucci's contract. And the movie stars Susan Lucci, Joanna Cassidy, and Robert Urich. From Spencer for Hire. But so it had a decent cast, right? And the part of this that's interesting was this movie was part of Susan Lucci's deal. They wanted her to come back and keep being their soap opera queen. Queen of Mean, I guess, is what she is. I don't know. I don't watch her soap operas, but I understand who she is. And so they signed her this big contract, but she wanted to reach outside of soap operas a little bit. So she had these I think it was 2 or 3 TV movies put in her deal where she got to do something different. And so the first script that came up was Invitation to Hell. It was a horror movie, and Susan Lucci agreed to it as long as, you look at the cast. You got Joanna Cassidy and Robert Ulrich in this too, who, man, I love that guy, Spencer for Hire. But she wanted a horror director. She wanted the studio to hire a horror director. And we're talking about like ABC TV studio or something, or CBS TV studio, whichever channel it was on at the time, whichever network. And they agreed to do it, and they went out and got Wes Craven, who had done, The Hills Have Eyes before this, and he had done Last House on the Left. So he had a name. I don't know if they actually knew what they were getting with that name, but it's an interesting movie. It's not the worst movie I've ever seen. It's not one of Wes's best movies. But it proves that even guys like Wes, they had to get a check at some time. They had to get a paycheck. So next we'll talk about Night of the Comet, another fun movie from '84. Kelly Maroney and Catherine Mary Stewart in this, directed by Thom Ebert. Night of the Comet is a fun movie. It's a kind of a genre mashup, and I think that works for it really well and makes it more fun than some of the other movies of that era. And of course we get to A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now this is Wes's masterpiece, his opus, right? Just a great movie all the way around, and I could talk about A Nightmare on Elm Street forever, guys. John Saxon, Heather Langenkamp, and Robert Englund, directed by Wes Craven, of course. Came from New Line Studio. Bob Shaye and his sister Lynn Shaye, who everybody knows now for being in Insidious and other movies like that. This was a passion project for Wes. He had been told by a lot of people that it wasn't going to work. Even Sean Cunningham, who had done Friday the 13th, told Wes this wouldn't work because essentially people would realize that if they woke up, that the killer would be gone and they wouldn't have to be scared anymore. So I don't think Sean Cunningham got this type of horror at that point. It's not really his strong suit to write this type of horror, although he did write House and help produce that. So yeah, it was an interesting shoot. Wes had to give a lot to Bob. You know, he had to write him an ending that would guarantee a sequel. He had to let Bob direct one shot of the film because he was insistent upon it. But all in all, it turned out great. And A Nightmare on Elm Street is, to this day, one of the greatest horror films in horror history, and also one of the most original horror films in horror history. So we also had Razorback with Gregory Harrison, a fun Australian movie. And Silent Night, Deadly Night, of course, everyone remembers. Great slasher from '84. I call it great. It does have Linnea Quigley in it, by the way. And it was directed by Charles E. Sellier Jr. But, I mean, that's about the only good things I can say about Silent Night, Deadly Night. I mean, the controversy is the biggest thing about it because they dropped the trailer for this. They scared the hell out of a bunch of kids. And they immediately made them pull the trailer, and that wasn't good enough. The Christian conservatives went after the movie itself and had it pulled from theaters, so nobody got to see it in the theaters either. Interestingly enough, the movie's not that bad, and it's not that good either. I mean, it's not that bad gore-wise. It's not, the trailer is probably the scariest thing about it when you're 6 years old watching a Santa Claus with an axe crawl down a chimney. That's way scarier than anything that's in this movie. And it was shot better, too. The trailer was shot far better than this movie was. But, moving on, guys. So, of course, we had Terror in the Aisles, which was another one of these weird clip movies where they just kind of clip stuff together and talk about horror movies. But it did have Donald Pleasance and Nancy Allen in it, and I've seen it a couple times. It's a fun watch. And, of course, The Toxic Avenger, Mitch Cohen, directed by Lloyd Kaufman and Michael Urs. What can you say about The Toxic Avenger, guys? It's a great schlock film. Of all the trauma movies, this is my favorite one. I've seen it. I've seen all the sequels. My dad was a big fan. And back then, I mean, that had a lot of weight in what I watched, what he was a fan of. And he just loved the sleaziness of The Toxic Avenger and the idea that this mutant guy could be a hero of some sort. So yeah, guys, that's the 30 movies that are right there in front of me that I can come up with for 1984. And I will say this, if I'm giving out grades here, I got to give 81 like a 9.5 out of 10. There's just so many good movies in there. Evil Dead, on and on and on. You have a lot of great movies like Possession and Evil Dead, stuff like that. And then it's surrounded, encapsulated by like 30 slasher films because of the rush on slasher films in '81 after the success of Friday the 13th and Halloween and all that. So yeah, guys, that's what we got for '84. Now, if I'm going to grade '84, I would probably give '84. I think it's going to get 7 out of 10, and it's only getting 7 out of 10. It doesn't have a great amount of quantity, but '84 does have some heavy hitters, and especially if you throw Ghostbusters in there as a horror/comedy film, it really works. All right, guys. Now, don't forget to hit the button here at the end that says subscribe, and you can catch all of our. We're going to be doing a few more of these. Hopefully, you guys will suggest some more movies, and we'll get to run down some more movies from the '80s and '60s and '70s and '90s, and so on and so forth. I think you can make cases for a couple years in the late 2000s, especially during that French Extreme movement, right? So yeah, don't forget to hit the subscribe button here at the end of the video, guys. And leave us your thoughts either on Facebook or here on YouTube. Leave us your thoughts about what you think the greatest year in horror history is. And we'll run it down step by step. We'll go through each film. We'll talk about it. And you guys can make the decision on your own. And we'll talk to you guys next time we got something we're talking about. Bye.